So this talk will be based on the book, and to just give an overview, I'll get to what the four futures are and how they kind of combine speculative fiction with social science. But first, I'll bring out the sort of threads and the themes that I'm working with to put together my model, basically. So one of them has to do with automation and technology and its implications for the future of work and the economy. One of them has to do with climate change and ecological crisis. And then both of these interact with economic inequality, class struggle over resources. So this sort of starting point for me, I come from a socialist Marxist background, is the famous quote from Rosa Luxemburg: bourgeois society stands at the crossroads, either transition to socialism or regression into barbarism. Hence the title of the talk, Socialisms and Barbarisms. That's what we're sort of imagining here. The idea that, as Wolfgang Streeck, who was mentioned earlier, has said, we are at a sort of an impasse here, and that some new form of society is going to have to arise, but that doesn't mean we sort of inevitably get the utopia or the dystopia. It's a political question, ultimately. And so this quote was also already used, that Frederick Jameson, I think, originally said it. It's now easier to imagine the end of the world than to imagine the end of capitalism. And so I'm hoping to use the tools of speculative fiction to encourage imagining the end of capitalism. Although, the nation state was also brought up, and that's an interesting one we can maybe talk about, because I don't really deal with that, but the issue of borders, citizenship, geographical unevenness does lurk behind, I think, everything I'm going to say in a way that maybe is a little troublesome for my model. But I also want to discourage the idea that we're sort of accelerating into some bright future, but that we have nothing to do with it, that some automatic process of machinic capital or Silicon Valley geniuses is bringing about some future, but that we have nothing to do but sort of sit on the internet and watch it go by. I want to bring the politics to it. So first, to get through the sort of starting point of where I think right now we're in a period of an increased level of what I would call automation anxiety, which is, I want to make the point that this is not a new thing, but in fact reflects an underlying dynamic that is central to capitalism and always has been, which is the tension between technology as a potential source of emancipation, of liberation from drudgery, and technology as a source of exploitation and domination. And so I'll start with something that we maybe don't think of as part of the anxiety over automation, but this is the pendulum clock invented by Christian Huygens in 1656, which measured time in a much more precise and reliable way than previous clocks, and it was through technologies like this that capitalists were able to set in motion the dynamic analyzed by Marx, in which they attempt to rationalize production in such a way to produce more with less labor and thereby increase profits. And so from this point forward, this is the anxiety, that is technology there to liberate us or is it there to dominate us? And so you get waves of, here we have, I should say early 1800s, not 1900s, excuse me. These are some Luddites, some machine breakers. Luddite now, of course, is used as an epithet to describe some kind of just objection to technology as such, but as Eric Hobsbawm said in a nice article about the Luddites, really this has to be understood not as opposition to technology, but as simply one way in which workers attempted to defend their conditions of life and to defend themselves from domination, and that breaking machines was a part of a larger set of tactics that could also include, vandalizing the employer's house and things like that. And so we should see that this is two-sided, not that this is not a question of technology, good or bad, but what kind of technology and what for. So this is again, 1800s. This is John Henry, the steel-driving man from American folklore, the story of a former slave who gets a job on the railroad after he achieves his freedom, but then encounters the steam-powered drill, which is potentially going to take his job away. He sets out to prove that he can work faster than the machine. He succeeds, and then he drops dead. So this also reflects this anxiety. Here in the 1920s, this is from Fritz Lang's Metropolis, we get more and more of this idea of this massive industrial infrastructure that sort of dominates and controls us as its appendages rather than serving our needs. Of course, there were also in the same period those who embraced technology and saw it leading to a bright future, but many of those, like the Italian futurists, actually tended in a fascist rather than an emancipatory direction. Here's in the 1970s. This picture is actually more recent, but this sort of reflects the period in which mass robotization and automation in manufacturing, especially in heavy industry, started to really get going. And so loss of manufacturing jobs, which is still a thing we're dealing with now, certainly in the United States. One of the dynamics underlying our politics today is that people like Donald Trump can appeal to the kind of former factory workers in the Rust Belt of the United States who've seen their jobs go away. He says they're all in China and Mexico. Some of that, it's a complicated question, but much of it is this underlying dynamic of technological displacement of labor. And the waves recur. 1990s, downsizing became a term everyone started using. You had popular books like Jeremy Rifkin's The End of Work, more theoretical books like Stanley Aronowitz and Bill DeFazio's The Jobless Future. And then, faded out again, and finally we get the most recent wave. This here is, you may remember, is Watson, the IBM computer that won on Jeopardy, which was really originally designed, its real purpose was to do things like review legal and medical documents. And so I think what distinguishes our current wave is that people are seeing automation and labor displacement move into the ranks of the professional managerial class and even into the ranks of some of the very journalists and pundits who write these articles about automation ending work. So this is all just to show that this is not a new thing, it's an underlying contradiction, and then the question becomes then, again, is there a way that we can kind of reclaim the technologies of extremely efficient production in a way that actually liberates our time, in a sense decapitalizes time, to take it out of this sort of regimented world in which you're either working for a wage for someone else, or if you can't get waged labor, you're hustling to get it, or you're navigating welfare bureaucracies or so on. So it's a question of, to the extent that I'm a sort of soft accelerationist, it's in the sense that I do believe that there is that potential is there. It's the classical sort of socialist idea that machines can liberate us from work. But I also think that it's not an inevitability and that this is a very two-sided question. All right, so then the other thing we have to deal with is, even if we could imagine a world in which the machines have eliminated all need for labor, have totally freed us, that doesn't matter if the techno-system we've created undermines its own conditions of existence by destroying the planet. This is just the indicative of the sort of way in which technology has not accrued to the benefit of all, productivity decoupled from wages, such that the people who own the robots are the ones who are making the money from them. But the question then becomes, what if these technologies, whether or not they can liberate us from work, are simply destroying the planet in such a way as to undermine our very conditions of existence? This, again, not a new theme in the history of capitalism. It's another fundamental contradiction. Here we have a scene from Victorian England meant to represent the poor conditions of sanitation. This was an issue that very much concerned Marx and Engels. At that time, there was much concern with the issue of declining soil fertility. The issue being that during the period of industrialization, as people moved into the cities, it disrupted a dynamic by which in a more rural society, the waste products of agriculture would go back into the soil and refertilize it. But now the shit was not going back into the soil, it was in the streets of London, which created decreasing soil fertility. And eventually that contradiction had to be resolved on another level by coming up with industrial fertilizers, replacing the nutrients that way. And this is where we get into this question of, what do we make of this massive techno system that we have created, and the way we have sort of reshaped nature itself. So here we have a very early piece of speculative fiction, Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, and which is often read as a sort of caution about the dangers of, Prometheanism, of ambitious technological intervention. I sort of tend toward the Bruno Latour's reading of it as more a warning about what happens if we are insufficiently attentive to the monsters we have created, if we do not love them, in his phrasing. In other words, that if we don't fully accept that we are now somehow the custodians of the earth, and that some level of planning of nature itself is required. And so here, this is a map of the nitrogen cycle, this whole issue of soil fertility and so on, which I like because, as opposed to the carbon cycle, which of course we all talk about now because of climate change, this is a dynamic that was recognized somewhat earlier, but is another example of where we have so completely insinuated humanity into the rhythms of agriculture that it's very difficult to imagine us going back from that. So now, yes, here we have, this is climate change. This is from the, this is actually from a US government website. I got it a week or two ago, so I don't know if Trump has removed it yet. And then, so this comparable graph to the one I showed before about productivity is, of course, this, the global temperature graph that we see rising and rising. So then this gets me to what Four Futures is. And so it's sort of, it's speculative, and so it sort of takes certain premises that are exaggerations, to say the least. It assumes a possibility of kind of mass total automation of everything, although I actually agree with Nina that there's a residual that's unautomatable, which actually will become very important in a minute, and I'll get back to. But I assume that sort of drudgery and like a lot of material production, we can kind of eliminate that. Even material things that are sometimes incorrectly mashed in with care work just because they're done by women, right? Bedpans can be changed by robots and things like that. But there's some other things which I'll get to. So then the question is, how does that interact with ecological limits? And how does it interact with the question of who benefits from potential abundance or who pays for whatever scarcity we have to deal with? And so the approach, I call this social science fiction. The idea is that I'm trying to avoid futurism. I don't want this to be one of those books you see in the airport bookstore that says, here's what's going to happen in 20 years and how you can profit from it. I want to use this model to sketch out, it could be called for presence, really, because as often been said, speculative fiction is always really about the time in which it's written. And so really it's a model that I want to use to situate certain fictional futures or fictional alternate worlds within our own world. Which aspects of our present world do they reflect, and how might that affect our political and social thinking about where we are today and where we want to go? So how do the four futures fall out? I have a nice little 2x2 grid. There's with two axes, one being the ecological axis, which I just label as scarcity and abundance, meaning you can imagine a sort of like super utopian situation in which we've gone to renewable energy and we have figured out how to better manage and reuse resources, and we've come up with some wonderful geoengineering technology to repair the damage we've already done. And so we don't have to be as worried about that. There's some futures that will reflect a world in which the ecological constraint is not so binding, while there will be others where repairing damaged ecosystems and managing scarce resources come to the fore as kind of the key issue. Then the other axis is my axis of class struggle, which basically says what kind of a social structure is implied in these worlds, and is it more one characterized by equality in which people have some kind of an equitable claim on resources, access to whatever abundance exists, shared sacrifice of whatever scarcity must be managed? Or is it something more like the hierarchy that characterizes our society, in which there is a ruling elite that monopolizes wealth and monopolizes social power? And so four kind of ideal typical worlds arise from that. And so the first one, the most kind of utopian one, I guess, equality and abundance, is the one I label communism in the, old 19th century Marxist sense of from each according to her ability to each according to his need. A world in which we are not spending most of our time working for someone else, whether that's a private employer or the government, in order to make stuff. We're engaging in whatever voluntary pursuits we truly enjoy. We're hunting in the morning and fishing in the afternoon and writing criticism after dinner as we please. And so what's a world that kind of embodies this? And for me, it's Star Trek, which was one of my earliest science fictional loves. And this image is the Replicator, which is a key piece of post-scarcity technology in Star Trek, where you just walk up to it and tell it what you want, and it makes you your cup of tea or whatever it is. And so, I was, one of the things I love about Star Trek that I think is underappreciated is the dramatic constraint that its creators posed by eliminating the main source of conflict in so much of our drama, by eliminating scarcity and eliminating the capitalist mode of production. And so they had to introduce, conflicts with aliens and so on. But there's also just a lot of soap opera in Star Trek. And in some ways, communism is kind of a big soap opera, and I don't mean that to make light of it, but actually to say that sort of those kinds of concerns are the most important ones of all, because they get exactly to this question of what cannot or should not be automated. And, if you take the sort of techno-optimistic vision of technology being sort of an instrument for liberation, then the question is instrumental for what? And to me, it's sort of this question of care interpreted in the sense of how do we take care of one another? How do we emotionally support one another? What kind of social fabric do we want to have? How do we reproduce that? And so these are the questions that arise. And so one of the things, I talk about some other fictional examples in this, when I talk about this. Cory Doctorow has some books that kind of deal with this, one of which has to do with a voluntary collective that's running a post-scarcity Disneyland. The thing I wanted to get at is this idea that this vision of a post-scarcity society is not one of a post-conflict society. And so I also talk about the idea that is often brought up that there are these sort of islands of communism that already exist in our world that we can point to, whether it's people coming together to write open source software or run a community garden or write Wikipedia. And I sort of talk about this idea that these projects are full of conflicts and hierarchies and difficulties that aren't reducible to the capital relation, that aren't reducible to the question of who makes money, although they're not totally separable from them either in capitalism. But, just read about the sort of way racism or misogyny or even just cliques and backbiting kind of affect any collective project, and you get at the sort of questions of how we relate to one another that exist in any form of life that we would want, I think, as humans. So it's this part of the model is meant to sort of like bring in these super utopian societies and kind of find where the conflict is in them. So then the second box I fill is the one where the scarcity question is one we have to answer. We can't sort of do what Star Trek does and says they have unlimited antimatter energy and they don't have to worry about what the replicators are feeding on. If we have to worry about that, then we have, I'm going to have to do this. I'm going to do this out of order, so I'm going to skip slides for a second. We have socialism. I call socialism as opposed to communism, again, in a sort of old-fashioned sense of this idea that you first have a state that has to kind of manage things in the post-revolutionary world, which maybe then can wither away into communism. But then the question is, what does this state or this kind of like large-scale organization have to do? And in this case, it's not, run the state-owned factories like the Soviet Union or something because we've automated that, right? But you have to manage scarcity. In other words, who can consume how much? It's managing, a lot of it is managing consumption, and so that involves planning and it involves some kind of democratic process to determine how that works. And then there's this question that I brought up before of the larger sense of planning the entire natural world, of somehow, this is where large-scale projects are necessary, right? That the Earth as a whole is something that we are now inevitably engaged in producing, producing nature, as the geographer Neil Smith put it. And so there, the future that I locate here is, among others, is Kim Stanley Robinson's Mars trilogy, which focuses on the idea of terraforming Mars to make it habitable for humans, and Robinson he was a member of the Mars Society. He researched this. It's like full of like the actual science of doing this. But the interesting thing that comes up in it is this very idea that you cannot separate the politics of social structure from this question of like this kind of massive project of intervening in the natural world. And it inverts the tropes of, a lot of environmentalism in a lot of ways, which sometimes people talk as though environmentalism is about withdrawing from nature, getting us uninvolved with nature, reducing our footprints, when in fact it requires a new, more rational way of managing nature. And so in the sort of clever trope in Robinson's book is that the people who don't want to terraform Mars and therefore want to make it uninhabitable are the reds, whereas the people that want to modify it and so that humans can live there are the greens. They want to make Mars green. So that's the kind of future that I locate in that world. So let me go back up to where I was before, which is the question of, back to abundance. The other problem Star Trek had is that it was full of the liberal faith that if you had the technical preconditions for a communist society, then you would get that society. But I think this is where some understanding of political conflict and class struggle becomes central, because that's not how ruling classes work. That's not how political struggle works in our world. the people who are on top will try to stay on top. But how do they do that in a world that's no longer so much based on human labor in the production process? And that gives rise to the system I refer to as rentism, or what I called it in the beginning when I first developed this, anti-Star Trek. Basically, you have the technology of Star Trek, but you have our social structures. And the key idea here is the idea of rent. So traditionally, rent means rent on land. But it's as a more general concept, it just means you own a piece of property and you make money simply by owning that piece of property, not by doing anything with it, not by producing things and selling them, but just by owning the rights to something, whether it's access to land or, increasingly in our world, access to intellectual property, patents and copyrights and so on. And so here, Apple, I don't know if it's, the iPhone at least used to say on the back something like, assembled in China, designed in California. And it's the people in California that have the intellectual property that make most of the money. Similarly, the value of a Nike shoe, it has much more to do with that swoosh than it does with the shoe itself. And just to tell you that these aren't just about trivial things, of course, pharmaceuticals are increasingly central to this. You have life-saving drugs that cost almost nothing to produce, but someone owns the patents to those and can therefore restrict access to them. So this world, I locate, Warren Ellis, among others, in his Transmetropolitan books, has a world that's sort of like this, where you have a replicator like in Star Trek, but you have to pay credits to make things, and your replicator can get computer viruses, and, Charles Stross's Accelerando is another book that starts off in a world where somebody's on the run from the copyright police. So that's the kind of imaginary where this takes place. The problems are not technical, they're political. And this is where, and it's, this may be a sort of virtualized capitalism, but it's also one where the coercive power of the state is extremely important. Because thinking about this kind of property highlights the fact that all property is not some kind of natural fact, it's something enforced by states. Somebody has to come and take you away if you download something you weren't supposed to. Somebody has to sue you, and so on. And so those are the kind of jobs, those are the kind of power structures that exist in societies of this type. So finally, we get back to, skip that because I don't have time, the final box, scarcity with hierarchy. So we keep going down, you go down a road where the fundamental problem here is that you are breaking another of the central contradictory logics of capitalism, which is the mutual interdependence between capital and labor, meaning bosses need workers to run their factories and their shops. Workers need bosses because they have no other way to survive and no other access to the means of production and the means of survival. If you break that logic, most people then become superfluous to the ruling class. And because it is a situation of scarcity, sharing out, rentism is not an option because you don't want to reduce your own standard of living just to keep this absurdist logic of rent extraction going. And so you get the rich basically lock themselves away in their enclaves while the rest of us are, we're on the streets, we're in refugee camps, we're in prisons. And eventually the logic of this is what I call exterminism, adapting E.P. Thompson's term that he used for a different purpose, to indicate there's a carceral and ultimately a genocidal logic to this form of existence, where the rich are in their private islands and then their gated communities, and we are outside, and they have ultimately their robot guards to protect them. The other image here, I could have chosen a lot of images to reflect this. Obviously, the European refugee crisis highlights a lot of these issues quite well. Because I'm from Minnesota, this is a path in northern Minnesota where African refugees have been trying to cross into Canada because they're afraid of deportation under Trump. People are like losing fingers and hands and ears from trying to make it into Canada through the snow. But in this picture, there are no people, because that's kind of the end game here, is no people but the tiny elite. And thus the earth, shrinks down to a population that it can manage. So in order to not end on that extremely bleak note, I will end with my conclusion, which is that this is still nothing. All of these trends exist, but none of these are really our futures. They are all our present. But we can, through the power of mass action, I do still believe it is possible to exacerbate positive features and suppress negative features of our current environment. And this is, of course, the semi-spontaneous, massive women's march in Washington, D.C. that happened in reaction to Donald Trump. And we have a long way to go figuring out the effective forms of struggle that that can confront the kinds of logics that I'm talking about here, but I'm hoping that some of what I've done here gives us some sort of tools to think about in a hopeful and not just dystopian way.